Hello fellow Clasher, this is Simon. Welcome to another strategy guide to Clash Royale. In today's video, we're going to be talking about some of the strongest decks in the game, hybrid decks. We're going to talk about how to build them and some of the strengths and weaknesses that they have. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of hybrid decks. We're going to talk about some basics behind what hybrid decks are and how to make the different types, and then we're also going to talk about specifically how to build them to make sure that they work for the current meta. If you're not familiar with some of the terminology that I'm using in this video, make sure you check my previous strategy guide videos. If you're a faithful follower of the channel and have subscribed in the past, you'll obviously do just fine. Subscribe. Before we get to pros and cons, let's talk about specifically what hybrid decks are. There are three different types of deck archetypes: Beatdown, Control, and Siege, and basically a hybrid deck is where you take some types of cards from one of those and another one, put them together, and output a hybrid deck. One that couldn't necessarily just be Control or just be Beatdown, but is a little bit of a mixture. Personally, I think that hybrid decks are some of the strongest decks in the game, but they definitely do have some of their weaknesses. They're really difficult to build. In fact, an incorrectly built hybrid deck will actually take some of the weaknesses of both the archetypes it is pulling from and not bring all of its strengths over, and that just makes for a bad deck. To get around this, it's important that you understand how the three different types of hybrid decks work, as well as have a good understanding of the current meta. In addition to being difficult to build, they're also difficult to play. The experienced player, however, will be able to get around this with a good understanding of how the game works. That being said, because you're given the choice of two different win conditions, if you choose the wrong one at the wrong time, then you're likely to lose a tower. In addition, if you only play one of the two win conditions, then you end up having a disadvantage because you have that one card just stuck in your hand the whole time, and that messes up with your card rotation. In this guide, I'm going to touch on how to play hybrid decks, but I'm mostly going to focus on how to build them correctly. If you'd like a full-blown guide on how to play hybrid decks, make sure you leave a comment in the section below. While hybrid decks can be difficult to play and difficult to build, they definitely have their pros to them. For example, they give you multiple options. This can be a crutch sometime if you choose the wrong option, but having multiple options actually really puts you at an advantage if you make sure you play the right option at the right time. One example of this is if you are playing a Control Beatdown hybrid and your opponent is playing a Beatdown deck. Beatdown decks tend to have a difficult time against Control decks, and so if you play a primarily Control playstyle and then throw in some Beatdown attributes when it's right, then you can definitely put your opponent on their toes and make it difficult for them to beat you. One really great pro to the hybrid deck style is split pushes. Now this does require for you to have quite a big advantage over your opponent, but if you do, you can have one archetype going down one lane and then another archetype going down the other lane, and that really puts them in a difficult position where it's almost impossible for them to defend both pushes. Another great pro to hybrid decks is a double threat. A double threat is where you have two win conditions that are very similar, for example the Hog Rider and the Giant, who both target defensive buildings. Let's say you are in a meta where Inferno Towers are very common, and Inferno Towers are used to try and stop both the Hog Rider and the Giant. In this situation, you might send the Hog Rider first, and then as soon as that Hog Rider is taken out by the Inferno Tower, and you can get rid of that Inferno Tower with a little bit of support, then you can place a Giant, and your opponent has already expended their Inferno Tower, so it makes it difficult for them to defend against you. Another great hybrid pro is workarounds. A workaround is where you take advantage of your opponent only having a counter to one of your win conditions by playing the other one. For example, if you have the Lava Hound and the Miner as your win conditions in your deck, your opponent may have a difficult time defending the Lava Hound. But then if they do, it's most likely that they're going to have a difficult time defending against the Miner. So depending on their deck and their cards, you're going to want to play the specific one that counters them the best. Before we can move on to actually building hybrid decks, it's important for us to understand some very important basics. The first thing we need to do is we need to break down all of the win conditions in Clash Royale into offensive and defensive cards, and then split them up into their archetypes, namely Beatdown, Control, and Siege. Offensive cards are cards that tend to offer more value on offense than on defense. For our offensive control cards, we have the Miner, Goblin Barrel, Hog Rider, and the Battle Ram. For our offensive beatdown cards, we have the Lava Hound, the Golem, and then the Giant. Then we have the Graveyard and the Balloon. These are cards that are considered control cards, but tend to need some type of a tank in order to get some real value. As such, they could be considered either control or beatdown cards. Lastly, we have the Royal Giant, who is a siege, control, beatdown combination. Depending on the way that you play the Royal Giant, he can be either one of those. He's most typically considered a beatdown card though. Now let's take a look at the defensive category. Our controlled defense cards are Sparky, the Three Musketeers, and then the Elite Barbarians. We also have our siege cards, which are the Expo and the Mortar, and the Rocket could also technically be considered an offensive card. It depends on how you use it, but it's usually giving more value on defense. As such, I put it in a defensive category. Then we have the Giant Skeleton, which is a defensive beatdown card. And finally, we have the PEKKA, which could be considered a control card if it's played correctly, but most primarily, it's a beatdown card. The defensive category actually contains a lot of win conditions that some people might not even consider real win conditions, simply because they don't offer very much value on offense and offer more value on defense. Now, why does this actually matter? By organizing the different win conditions into these offensive and defensive categories, we can then take a look at the three main hybrid deck types. You have double defense decks that takes two of the defensive win conditions and puts them into the same hybrid deck. And then you have double offense decks, which contain two offensive win conditions. Then we have balanced hybrid decks, which contain an offensive and a defensive win condition. Before we get on to double defense deck building, I did want to briefly mention that double defense decks are by far the most difficult ones to play successfully, because they're so defensive. In a game where offense is primarily considered the best strategy, these decks do tend to struggle. They do, however, do really great on the ladder, where you can pull out a draw when you can't get damage onto your opponent's tower. That can be a very frustrating way to play, but it does have its purpose. Obviously, the first step in building a double defense deck is to select two defensive win conditions. After you've done that, your next step is to select 2 to 3 win condition support cards. You actually want to add a lot of win condition support into your deck because your defensive win conditions are already primarily defensive, and you want a lot of support to try and get damage onto the tower. After that, you'll want to select 1 to 2 anti-meta defense cards, cards that are specifically geared towards countering popular cards in the meta. One of these could actually be your defensive win condition, so make sure you keep that in mind. Finally, you're going to want to select the last spots in your deck and really try and fill them with cards that are going to help try and cover any specific weaknesses that your deck might have. I do highly recommend including some type of a direct spell damage card into your deck, like the Fireball, the Rocket, Lightning. Because these decks do struggle on offense, you're going to want to try and make sure that you can get some quick damage on the tower if it really is needed. Here's one example of a double defense deck where we have the PEKKA and the Mortar working together. They're supported on offense by the Log, the Poison, and also the Night Witch. And then on defense, we do have the Electro Wizard and the Mega Minion in there. The Goblins play an important role of just kind of being a very versatile defense card for situations where you need some type of a cheap card. Up next, we have double offense deck building. These decks are actually decks that most people start out with trying to play when they do try and do hybrid decks. Double offense decks actually do a really great job at getting rid of opponents' towers. You might not necessarily win because they do struggle on defense, but if you're looking for some type of a quick crown farming deck, double offense decks are really fantastic. The first step is to pick 2 offensive win conditions. After you've done that, you're going to want to select 1 win condition support card. It's very important that this 1 win condition support card does a good job at supporting both of your offensive win conditions. That way it doesn't matter which one is on your hand and you're going to make a push for it, you can use this card to help support them no matter which play you're playing. Because double offense decks actually struggle on defense, it's important to include a good majority of cards into your deck as anti-meta defense cards. You'll want to select 2 to 3 cards for this. Lastly, you have 2 to 3 slots left to try and make sure that you fill them and cover any weaknesses that your deck might have. The first example of a double offense deck that I wanted to go over is Jason's deck. Jason used this deck to win the first official Clash Royale tournament. It features the Giant and the Hog Rider as the primary offensive win conditions, and then it has the Arrows as the offensive win condition support. For his anti-meta defense, he had the Barbarians, Minion Horde, and the Archers, which did a great job at countering the meta at the current time. Finally, he put in the Spear Goblins and the Elixir Collector to fill those gaps. One important thing you want to recognize when you're building your double offense deck is what your worst possible defensive hand would be. For Jason's deck, that would be the Hog Rider, Giant, the Elixir Collector, and the Arrows. If he had all of those cards in his hand when his opponent plays some sort of a threat, he would have to cycle to other cards, and that is one of the weaknesses of double offense decks. Make sure that you try and account for that so that you don't find yourself in difficult situations like that. Did my clothes just change? The last hybrid is the balanced hybrid. Honestly, I think that this hybrid is the best to try and make. It's the easiest to learn, but it does take a little bit of workaround to try and make sure that the deck actually works well. The first thing that you want to do is you want to select an offensive and a defensive win condition. It doesn't really matter which one you pick first, it just matters that the two of them work really well together. I tend to prefer my offensive win condition first because I try to pick an offensive win condition that isn't easily countered by the current meta cards, but you're absolutely fine starting with defensive win condition and then going from there. Then when it comes to picking your two win conditions, it's important that the two of them do a good job at supporting each other. In this example right here, the Battle Ram does a really great job at getting rid of Inferno Towers and other buildings so that the PEKKA can get right to the tower. And the PEKKA is a really strong defensive card that can be used to try and clear a lot of really meta cards. You'll also want to make sure that your defensive win condition does a good job at countering the meta at the time. The next step is to select 1 to 2 win condition support cards. These are cards that you're going to want to be able to help support both of your win conditions if you need either one of them to be the primary tower destroyer. With the example above, the Baby Dragon would actually do a really good job of supporting both the PEKKA and the Battle Ram if Tombstones were really popular as a defensive card. Next, you want to select 1 to 2 anti-meta defense cards. These are cards that are going to counter the current meta, but try and do it a little bit differently than your defensive win condition does. For example, the PEKKA doesn't do anything against air troops, so it would be important for these anti-meta defense cards to target air if air cards were very popular in the meta. Lastly, you have 2 to 4 spots that you're going to want to fill in there to make sure that your deck is well rounded out, doesn't have any major weaknesses as well. This deck is a variation of a balanced hybrid deck that I made 3 or 4 months ago. It's the one that I won 14 challenges in a row with, almost half of them were grand challenges. You can see some of the principles that I talked about in this deck and why this deck does such a good job with the meta. Now let's go ahead and actually have an example of how you might go about building a hybrid deck. First of all, let's go ahead and start with a primary win condition, the offensive one. I decided to go with a Hog Rider because a lot of people are building decks around countering cards that don't include the Hog Rider. There's not a very strong defensive building meta right now, and so the Hog Rider seems like a good option. Up next, I wanted to select a defensive win condition that could really help clear some big pushes, and the Giant Skeleton does a pretty good job at actually being able to stop really big pushes like Golem pushes, even PEKKA pushes, and if you have 3 Musketeers all in one lane, then it's an excellent defense for getting rid of them. In order to help both of these win conditions try and get damage onto the tower if need be, then I have the Poison and the Log, because these are going to be good ones that are going to be able to help get rid of defensive buildings and do some extra damage onto the tower if need be. Because Battle Rams and Bandits are very popular in the meta right now, I feel like the Tombstone is a really good anti-meta defense card to include in there. It defends a lot of different cards than the Giant Skeleton would, and works together with the Giant Skeleton to clear different types of cards. Lastly, I decided to fill the rest of the slots with the Knight, because he's just really good at defending cards like the Night Witch behind pushes, the regular Goblins, and then the Electro Wizard as its primary defense against the Battle Ram. Obviously, the next step after you've built a good deck is to go and try it out. I did exactly that, and I found that I did struggle against 3 Musketeer heal decks, so I decided to put the Fireball in there instead of the Poison. This really helped round things out as well. In addition, I felt like the Knight was a little bit more defensive, and I wanted to add another card in there that could both be a good defense and add as an offensive support with my Giant Skeleton, so I switched him out with a Mega Minion. I really like to test my decks in classic challenges, so I went ahead and did that. I ended up getting 12 wins my very first time. I haven't tried a grand challenge with it yet, but that's definitely the next step. Now that you understand how you should go about building a good hybrid deck, go ahead and try it out for yourself. I'm going to respond to all the comments posted in the first 24 hours of this video being released, so if you build a good hybrid deck, go ahead and post it in the comments and let me know it. I'd be happy to rate it for you. For now, thank you so much for watching and subscribing. This is Kairos Time ticking by, and we will see you in the arena.